1. Opening. The deadliest lie about cold sleep. Most people who die from cold do not die because they lack blankets. They die because they misunderstand how the human body actually loses heat. That truth is uncomfortable, but it is also the reason tens of thousands of World War II soldiers survived nights that should have killed them. They did not survive because they had better sleeping bags. In many cases, they had none at all. And yet, in frozen forests, ruined cities, open fields and shallow foxholes, they endured. Here is the question that modern survival culture rarely asks honestly. Why did soldiers in the 1940s survive brutal winters without modern insulation, while people today sometimes freeze to death with gear that is lighter, warmer, and far more advanced? The answer is not courage, it is not toughness, and it is certainly not comfort. World War II soldiers did not optimize warmth. They optimized something far more important: heat control. What they practiced, often without scientific language, was survival thermodynamics. They learned where heat actually escapes the body, how quickly it disappears, and how to slow that process using whatever they had on hand. This video is not about nostalgia. It is about physics, biology, and hard-earned lessons paid for with human lives. And if you live in a country where winter storms, power outages, vehicle breakdowns, or grid failures are real possibilities, what you are about to hear is not history for curiosity's sake. It is history that still works. Second, why sleeping bags failed in World War II conditions. Modern survival advice treats the sleeping bag as the ultimate solution. Buy the right one, zip it up, and the cold is supposedly defeated. But World War II quickly exposed the limits of that thinking. Early war sleeping bags were heavy, bulky, and slow to dry. Once wet, they lost their loft and trapped almost no insulating air. Soldiers operating on foot, under constant movement and unpredictable conditions, often abandoned them entirely. A sleeping bag soaked by snow, rain, or sweat became dead weight long before it became a shelter. But the deeper reason sleeping bags failed was not design. It was context. War is not camping. Soldiers could not stop moving when conditions demanded it. They marched, fought, dug, ran, and carried loads for hours, sometimes days. Movement meant sweat, and sweat changed everything. Moisture inside clothing accelerates heat loss far faster than cold air alone. When soldiers finally stopped to rest, their bodies faced a dangerous shift. Metabolic heat production dropped, while wet fabric began pulling warmth away from the skin. From a thermal perspective, this created a perfect storm. Evaporative heat loss from sweat stripped energy rapidly. Conduction from the ground drained warmth continuously. Wind increased convective loss, carrying heat away the moment it escaped the body. A sleeping bag, no matter how thick, addressed only one part of that system, and often the wrong one. This is why soldiers sometimes woke colder than when they lay down. The bag promised insulation, but it ignored moisture, ground contact, and airflow. In short, it solved the problem of comfort, not the problem of survival. Sleeping bags did not fail because they were poorly made. They failed because they were designed to trap warmth, when the real battle was stopping heat from escaping in the first place. Third, the real enemy: ground, moisture, stillness. Cold air feels like the enemy, but World War II taught soldiers something far more dangerous. The real killers were quieter and less obvious. The first was the ground. Earth, stone, frozen soil, and snow pull heat relentlessly from the body through conduction. Unlike air, the ground never warms up. It acts as an infinite heat sink. Soldiers learned that lying directly on soil could drain body heat faster than standing in sub-zero air. The second enemy was moisture. Sweat trapped in fabric becomes a powerful heat pump. As it evaporates, it strips warmth from the skin far more efficiently than wind ever could. Men who kept damp clothing on at rest often became colder, not warmer, even when wrapped in layers. The third was stillness. When the body transitions from movement to rest, heat production drops sharply. This moment, often just after lying down, proved deadly. Military manuals and personal accounts repeatedly noted the same grim observation. Soldiers who slept normally often woke up colder than before they rested. Veterans described nights where exhaustion tempted them to collapse wherever they stood. Those who did often paid the price. Others learned to intervene in the process. They insulated themselves from the ground. They removed moisture. They controlled airflow. And they understood something that modern gear marketing still struggles to explain. A soldier sleeping at -10 degrees with proper ground insulation frequently fared better than one sleeping at freezing temperatures without it. Temperature alone was never the deciding factor. Heat loss pathways were. This realization changed everything. World War II soldiers stopped chasing more warmth. Instead, they focused on preventing heat from escaping at all. That shift in thinking would shape the survival methods that followed, methods that remain just as relevant today as they were on frozen battlefields more than 70 years ago. Fourth, the core trick: sealed microclimate, not insulation. At the heart of this entire method is a simple idea that most people still misunderstand. Warmth does not come from piling on blankets. It comes from controlling the air around your body. World War II soldiers were not trying to create comfort. They were trying to create a sealed microclimate. That is a critical difference. A pile of loose insulation allows warm air to move, circulate, and escape. A sealed microclimate traps a thin layer of warm air and prevents it from moving at all. This is why tight wrapping mattered more than thickness. Soldiers learned to wear dry inner layers pulled close to the skin. These layers captured body heat immediately instead of allowing it to dissipate. Over that, outer garments were drawn tight, not loose, creating a barrier that stopped air from flowing in or out. The goal was not loft. The goal was stillness. From a physics standpoint, warm air that cannot move loses heat far more slowly than warm air that circulates. Once airflow is eliminated, heat loss drops dramatically. This is why a thin but sealed system often outperformed bulky insulation in the field. The soldier's body became the heat source, and the trapped air became the buffer. Veterans later described the sensation not as warmth, but as stability. The temperature stopped falling. The shivering slowed. The body conserved what little energy it had left. That was enough to survive the night. This is the moment where modern survival thinking often goes wrong. Comfort feels safe, but comfort encourages looseness, gaps, and airflow. In extreme cold, comfort kills heat. Control preserves life. 5. Moisture discipline. The bravest decision is to undress. One of the hardest lessons soldiers had to learn was also the most counterintuitive. Sometimes, the act that saves your life feels like the one that will kill you. Keeping wet clothing on in the cold feels safer. You are already cold, and the idea of removing layers seems unthinkable. But World War II taught a brutal truth. Wet fabric is not insulation. It is a heat pump. Moisture pulls heat away from the skin through evaporation at an astonishing rate. A damp shirt or pair of socks can drain body heat faster than cold wind. Soldiers who clung to wet clothing often became colder by the minute, even while wrapped in layers. Those who survived learned discipline. They changed into the driest clothing they had before resting, even if it meant enduring a few minutes of intense cold. Wet socks were hung inside jackets near the torso, where body heat could slowly dry them overnight. This practice was documented across multiple armies, from German mountain troops to Soviet infantry. Physiologically, this worked because the body could finally stabilize. Dry fabric slowed evaporative heat loss. Energy stopped bleeding away. The body could conserve instead of constantly compensating. This lesson remains painfully relevant today. Many cases of hypothermia in winter hikes, snowstorms, and vehicle breakdowns in the United States follow the same pattern. People overdress while moving, sweat heavily, then stop and collapse into the cold. Gear fails, not because it is inadequate, but because moisture was ignored. The rule that saved lives then still applies now. Dryness is insulation. Thickness is an illusion. Sixth, ground insulation, the line between life and death. If moisture was the silent thief, the ground was the executioner. World War II soldiers learned quickly that cold air is survivable, but cold ground is relentless. Stone, soil, frozen earth, and snow conduct heat continuously and without mercy. Once your body is in direct contact, warmth flows out faster than you can replace it. This is why soldiers were taught never to sleep directly on the ground, no matter how exhausted they were. Even a small barrier could mean the difference between waking up alive or not waking up at all. Improvisation became routine. Helmets were placed under the torso. Backpacks were flattened beneath the spine. Pine branches, straw, spare clothing, or folded shelter halves were used to break contact with the earth. The height did not matter nearly as much as the interruption of conduction. Modern tests confirm what soldiers learned the hard way. A thin foam pad can outperform a high-end sleeping bag if the bag is placed directly on cold ground. And yet, many modern emergency kits focus heavily on blankets and neglect ground insulation entirely. This oversight has consequences. In winter storms and roadside emergencies across America, people wrap themselves tightly but lie directly on frozen surfaces. The ground drains heat until exhaustion sets in, and exhaustion leads to fatal mistakes. World War II left behind a rule that remains unbroken. Never fight cold air before you defeat the ground. Seventh, body positioning. Turn your body into a heat vault. By the time World War II soldiers learned to control moisture and ground contact, they discovered another truth that modern advice rarely emphasizes. How you position your body can determine whether heat is preserved or wasted. From a thermal perspective, the human body is not a uniform shape. Heat is generated deep in the core, where vital organs are protected, while it escapes most rapidly through exposed surface area. The more surface you present to the cold, the faster warmth disappears. Soldiers were taught to reverse that equation. Instead of lying flat, they curled inward. Knees were drawn toward the chest. Elbows were pulled tight against the ribs. The chin was tucked down to shield the neck and upper chest. This posture reduced exposed surface area and concentrated warmth around the organs that mattered most. It was not comfortable. In fact, it often caused stiffness and soreness by morning, but comfort was never the objective. The body became a sealed vault, protecting its internal heat the same way ancient builders protected fire inside thick stone walls. Men who slept, stretched out, lost heat faster and shivered harder. Those who curled inward stabilized sooner. Over time, this posture became instinctive, not because it felt good, but because it worked. In the calculus of survival, comfort was a luxury. Geometry was life. This lesson still applies. Whether stranded in a vehicle, caught in a winter storm, or forced to rest without shelter, body positioning remains one of the fastest ways to reduce heat loss without any equipment at all. 8. Group heat. Why loners die first. As the war dragged on, soldiers learned another lesson that challenged deeply held myths about toughness and self-reliance. In extreme cold, isolation kills faster than fear. Accounts from multiple fronts describe squads sleeping pressed tightly together, back to back or side by side, under shared shelter material. This was not sentimentality, it was physics. Bodies generate heat, and when those heat sources are combined, they create a shared microclimate far more stable than any individual could produce alone. Men rotated positions during the night, so no one remained on the cold edge for too long. Heat flowed from the center outward, exhaustion eased, survival odds improved. Entire units endured sub-zero nights this way when solo sleepers did not. This reality stands in sharp contrast to modern survival myths that glorify the lone individual battling the elements through sheer willpower. Cold does not care about pride. It responds only to physics. A shared thermal space reduces heat loss, slows exhaustion, and preserves life. The same principle appears repeatedly in modern rescue data. Lone campers, isolated hikers, and solo vehicle sleepers are far more likely to succumb to hypothermia than those who stay together. World War II simply made this truth impossible to ignore. Survival is not individual toughness, it is cooperative physics. 9. The shelter half. Why one piece of canvas beat a sleeping bag. Perhaps the most underestimated tool of World War II was also one of the simplest. The shelter half was nothing more than a triangular sheet of canvas, yet in many situations it proved more valuable than a sleeping bag. Its power lay in what it blocked and what it allowed. Canvas stopped wind completely, eliminating convective heat loss. At the same time, it could be adjusted. Soldiers could seal it tightly to trap warmth or vent it to release moisture and prevent overheating. This flexibility mattered in environments where conditions changed by the hour. Unlike sleeping bags, the shelter half adapted to movement, exhaustion, and uncertainty. It could be wrapped around the body, layered with another soldier's sheet, or folded beneath as ground insulation. It was not specialized. It was versatile. This reflected a broader World War II design philosophy. Equipment had to work across multiple conditions, not just ideal ones. Adaptability mattered more than optimization. A tool that could be adjusted on the fly often outperformed gear designed for a single purpose. Modern survival equipment is often rigid. It assumes predictable use and stable conditions. The shelter half assumed chaos. That assumption is why it saved lives. In extreme cold, the most effective tools are not always the most advanced. They are the ones that adapt when everything else goes wrong. 10. Why modern America forgot this knowledge. If this knowledge worked so well, the question naturally follows, why did it disappear? Not because it was wrong, not because it was outdated, but because the world around it changed. After the war, peace returned, and with peace came stability. Heating systems improved, homes became warmer, power grids expanded. Survival knowledge slowly shifted from necessity to background noise. What had once been essential became optional, and what is optional is easily forgotten. At the same time, marketing stepped in where experience once ruled. Survival stopped being about understanding how the body works and became about owning the right equipment. Warmth was sold as a product, not as a process. Comfort became the goal, and discomfort became something to avoid at all costs. Gradually, survival itself was transformed into a lifestyle. It became something aesthetic, curated, and consumable. Gear reviews replaced hard lessons, convenience replaced discipline, and the quiet truths learned in frozen forests were buried beneath the promise that technology could solve everything. But technology does not remove physics. The human body still loses heat the same way it did 80 years ago. Ground still drains warmth. Moisture still accelerates heat loss. Stillness still lowers heat production. None of that changed when the war ended. What changed was our relationship to risk. And when risk feels distant, knowledge fades. 11th final lesson. Survival is about understanding, not owning. World War II survival was never about having more. It was about knowing where heat escapes and how to stop it. Soldiers survived because they understood heat loss pathways. They controlled moisture. They insulated themselves from the ground. They sealed airflow. They positioned their bodies wisely. They worked together. And they adapted continuously to conditions that refused to stay stable. Control mattered more than comfort. Systems mattered more than gear. These lessons are not abstract. They apply directly to modern life in America. Winter storms still knock out power. Vehicles still break down on icy roads. People still become stranded in the cold, waiting for help that arrives too late. In those moments, understanding how to preserve heat matters far more than owning the latest equipment. A thin barrier under your body can save more energy than a thick blanket above it. Dry clothing can protect you longer than expensive insulation. A sealed microclimate can outperform any loose layer of comfort. And cooperation can keep people alive when isolation cannot. History did not save lives because it was old. It saved lives because it was correct. And the cold has not changed its rules since then.